Now, live from Whitney Media, 1460 WVOX, the Greenberg Report, with Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner. You can join in the conversation at 914-636-0110. Now on 1460 WVOX, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, my name's Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenberg Town Supervisor.
I'm David Bach. I'm the co-host, and I am the host of Talking Westchester and Ball is Life.
And today we have a very interesting program. I was a little nostalgic before today's program because way back in 1983, when I first was running for county legislator, I knocked on many, many doors, and a lot of people slammed the doors on me, or when they saw me coming, they looked around the other way. But there was one man who encouraged me. His name was Harry Greisman, and we spent a lot of time. He supported my uphill battle for legislator, and I remember him because there were so few initial supporters. I remember Harry telling me to be myself, and he helped come up with slogans that helped me succeed and get elected, like choose Paul Feiner or get a politician. So I, in some ways, owe my success to Harry. And today we're going to be interviewing his son-in-law, David Greene, who wrote a book, He Could Make Words Sing, An Ordinary Man During Extraordinary Times, about Harry. And it's not only about Harry, it's also about the 20th century. So welcome, David, to the program.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, David.
Maybe you could start just by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm bicoastal. I was born in Los Angeles, and when I was still a toddler, brought back to New York by my parents, kicking and screaming. I like to say I was kidnapped, and brought up in the Bronx. Went to school in the Bronx, raised on the streets of the Bronx. Met my wife, Jamie Greisman, now Jamie Greisman Greene. And then had taught in New York City for 16 years, then taught at Woodlands in Greenberg for 4 years, and then taught at Scarsdale High School for 18 years. Also coached at Ardsley High School, where I met David, and for about 4 or 5 years after what I call graduated from high school. Most people call it retiring, but I hate to use that word. And then I've been working as a public school advocate since then and mentoring new teachers, and was an adjunct professor of teaching at Fordham University. Wrote a first book about teaching, and then about, I guess now it's a year and a half ago or so, I read a book by a friend of mine who wrote a book about her dad in World War II, who was at Anzio, and his particular company was probably the most devastated company in all of World War II's European theater. And so that reminded me that buried in Harry's old house, which we had purchased in Ardsley, and we lived in for 32 years, one of the agreements we had for getting the good price we got was that we had to clean out the garage and clean out the basement, which was loaded with his stuff. So his kids called him a hoarder. I just called him an archivist. And then I realized he had all this really interesting material down there that is actually the basis of the book.
That's so that's so interesting. A lot of people would not write positive stories about their father or mother-in-laws. Did you always get along with your father-in-law, and was he somebody you always looked up to?
I mentioned it. I mentioned in the book that he's a pretty quiet guy, as many men in his generation were, and he and I got along fairly well. He actually taught me how to write, because he was as the title says, he was a great writer. He could make words sing. Comes from a line from a woman that he met when he was Camp Butner in North Carolina at the beginning of World War II when he was being trained, and she picked him over another guy by the name of Harry that she met because she said he could make words sing. That's also his epitaph. So he helped me with writing. He helped me with some things of that nature. He was a great tennis player. He helped me pick up that game. But for the most part, it was just on again, off again kind of stuff. But it's a tribute to not just him. It's a tribute to all the men like him and all of the people who grew up during his period of time.
We're going to have to take a break right now, and then after the break, we're going to learn more about Harry Greisman. We're also going to be learning more about the book, He Could Make Words Sing, An Ordinary Man During Extraordinary Times. And we'll talk a little bit about the generation and the 20th century. And does history repeat itself? I'm Paul Feiner, Greenberg Town Supervisor.
WVOX. Now back to the Greenberg Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner, and David Bach and I are interviewing David Greene, who wrote a book about his father-in-law. He could make words sing, an ordinary man during extraordinary times. We were talking before about the importance of the story of your father-in-law, and why is it relevant to people now?
Well, the subtitle is really what tells that story. It's a paraphrase from a quote by Admiral William Halsey of World War II fame when he was talking about the men that served under him. And he basically said, it's not that they're extraordinary, it's that ordinary men rise to who they become in extraordinary times. And when you take a look at the 20th century, and Harry was born in either 1915 or 1916, nobody's ever sure because records back then weren't really accurate. But he lived through World War I and his generation, and because it's not just about him, it's about everybody in his generation, and mine as well, and Paul's too. Not so much David's.
No.
So he lived through World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the post-war boom, the Red Scare, the Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, the Sputnik scares, space race, and nuclear Holocaust scares, Vietnam, civil rights, Watergate, Nixon, all the things, and that's just three quarters. That's like 50 years of all of that going on in one particular period of time. Things sort of quieted down, after that. But then, of course, there was the burning down of the Bronx, and riots in cities, and all of those things going on. And when we see today, here we are in 2018, and sure we've had some troubled times. We've had a great recession, not as bad as a depression. We've had issues with our president and the head of state of North Korea, who he likes to call Rocket Man. And I recall, okay, so he's going head to head with him, but that wasn't as scary as when President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev went head to head at the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. When I was 12, and we were watching television saying, okay, this is the last day we're all going to live because the United States and the Soviet Union are going to throw 7,000 nuclear weapons at each other, and the whole world is going to be obliterated. So the point is that they survived, we survived, we learned how to deal with those issues. And as we are now still in the early stages of the 21st century, and there's so much more to come, the question becomes, how can we learn from how they dealt with and survived, and not just survived, succeeded in life, to see how we can do that now. And, David is a member of the generation of my kids. I now have a 1-year-old grandson. And the point is, what can we pass along to David's generation and to my grandson's generation from what we learned and what Harry learned through their lives?
And, it's also interesting because every generation thinks that it's their generation is living under the worst circumstances, and then you look back at the 20th century, and there were things, as you said, that were much worse.
Yeah, and
with the exception of the president.
And everybody says that, of course. And it's funny because one of the things in the book is that we have a treasure trove of letters that Harry wrote during World War II that are included in the book that were also included in a book by Larry King called Love Letters During World War II. And in one of them, as he's sitting in Camp Butner trying to figure out what's going to happen next in his life, and it's 1941, and he's saying, well, exactly what you said. Everybody thinks their issues are the worst, and here we are in 1941, and is it going to ever get any better than or worse than this? And so back in 1941, he's saying the same thing you're saying now in 2018, and that's the point.
Right. Could you just tell us a little bit about Harry Greisman?
Sure. Harry was the son of Austrian immigrants, Jewish son of Austrian immigrants, raised in Brooklyn. Was the first in his family, as were many at the time, to go to a university. He went to Baruch, what is now called Baruch. Back then it was the City University, City College of Business and Civic Administration. And he went because his older siblings said, you're going to college, even though they didn't. And at the time, during the Depression, because he was in college from 1933 to 1937. He started college when President Roosevelt was saying there's nothing to fear but fear itself. They sacrificed their lives so that he could get ahead. So he did that. He became a writer there. He was the editor of the school newspaper and writing about what was going on in Europe and the build-up to war in Europe up until 1937 and what was happening and what was going on in terms of the anti-Semitism in Germany. And so you know that when then they graduate and it's 1937, they're trying to figure out, okay, what's going to happen next? The level of high anxiety then had to be so much greater than it is now. Then he went on, he was drafted, he was in an artillery battalion in the 78th Regiment. He became a forward observer, which was one of the most dangerous jobs in the world now. Today, we don't have them. We have drones who do this from the sky that are directed from people 3,000 miles away. But at the time, you were a forward observer. You went to the lines and oftentimes behind the lines to direct artillery fire to the enemy, trying to miss yourself and your comrades. After I wrote the book, I actually got an email from a gentleman who was a forward observer with Harry, and I wish I had known about this guy beforehand because he told me stories about what went on and Harry didn't, including one time where they were in a house overlooking a town. This was at the Battle of the Bulge, and unbeknown to them, a British tank pulled up next to them and blared loudspeakers to the town that the German army, they should surrender or they should leave or this was going to happen to them. And then they turned a flamethrower on the house that Harry and the other forward observers were in, not knowing they were there. And we never knew that. But that's the kind of stuff that forward observers went through. At the end of the war, he, as many other soldiers at the time, was dumped by his girlfriend at the time, the one who wrote all those love letters with him that I mentioned earlier. Came back to Brooklyn, married, got a job at an advertising agency that was swallowed by Vic International. Then it was Richardson Vic. So he became a creative, did advertising that was represented in the show Mad Men. Moved to Westchester, to Ardsley, where he lived for 32 years, had 3 children, one of whom I married, and there we are.
That's great. We have to take another break, and we'll be right back right after the break, and we'll learn more about Harry Greisman, and we'll also discuss the times and anti-Semitism as well, another issue that occurred, that happened in the 20th century, I guess the 19th century, the 21st century, every century. Yeah. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenberg Town Supervisor, and David Greene's my guest.
VOX. There's always something happening at 1460 on your radio.
1460 WVOX.
Now back to the Greenberg Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenberg Town Supervisor. And today we're talking about a man, Harry Greisman, who made words sing. He was an ordinary man during extraordinary times, and his son-in-law, David Greene, wrote a book about him that really is very, very interesting. If somebody wants to get the book, how do they get it?
Thanks. It's available both on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com, and local Barnes and Nobles are stocking them because I'm going to be doing talks and events there too.
Have you gone to libraries as well?
The Yonkers Library and the White Plains Library are going to have copies of the book so far, and I'm trying to contact others as well.
What about Greenberg?
I've contacted them. They haven't gotten back to me. Paul, you need to work on that.
I'll have to see if
The Ardsley Library as well.
I know. I've contacted them. It's interesting because you try to email and call, and everybody's so busy. It's just, and you don't want to be. We were talking earlier. You don't want to be a pain. Especially if you self-publish a book like this is, and it's very difficult to get a self-published book out there promoted and marketed, no matter how many good reviews it may have. And there's a lot of people who, like me, have done that in libraries and places like that have been, and independent bookstores have been bombarded, I think, and much more so than in the past. So I think it's more difficult for them to kind of get back and follow up.
No, on the other hand, as more people move away kind of from, reading actual books and they move more to like the internet stuff, you would imagine they'd kind of want more books like this just to beef up their supply. Especially if people are enjoying what you're writing, they're going to be like, oh, more people are going to come in now to get these type of books.
My thoughts, especially local, because this is the book, again, as Paul pointed out, it's about my father-in-law who's a local New Yorker. He was a Westchester resident for 40 years before he did the snowbird thing and retired down to Florida, as so many in that generation have, and my generation have. And so you would think that would be an attraction to it, but still, it's kind of hard.
And again, you were talking about ordinary man in an extraordinary time. Although Harry was more than ordinary. He did a lot of great things. But when I read the book, I was saying to myself, you knock on doors as a candidate and you speak to people, and there's so many people who have interesting stories that nobody knows about.
Exactly, and that's the piece about him. And ordinary is there because of extraordinary, because of the rhyme of the words, and is ordinary in the sense that he's just like everybody else. He's an everyman, all right, and we all have those stories, and all of our families have those stories, and we can all relate to the experiences that Harry went through. And it's interesting because Dave is around the age of my son. And so when my son read the book, he learned things about his grandfather that he never knew. And he also learned things about how people lived through the 20th century that he didn't know, even though he was a good student in high school. So, that's the idea. When I think you learn more about history through learning how people lived through history than you do by names and dates and stuff. I taught history for 38 years, and that's one thing that I learned very early on, that if you don't make it personal, if you don't make it alive, it's boring as hell.
Well, it was interesting because a couple of weeks ago we had on the show Elaine Finsilver, and she was living in Harstell, near where you are on Joyce Road, and she basically took in the first African-American who went to Ardsley High School, and they were like spitting in front of her on her lawn. And this was in 1963. And I said, I've known her for so many years, but I never realized what an extraordinary thing she did at that time. And we think integration is something that you don't think twice about now, but at that time it was very courageous what she did.
Absolutely, and Greenberg was even more courageous because it was one of the few places, along with New Rochelle, where we are now, that actually implemented the the Brown versus Board of Education Topeka, Kansas, and integrated systematically and systemically their entire school districts.
Right. What parallels do you find in the life he lived as today's and compared to today's world?
Well, if we were living 100 years ago, we'd call Harry's generation dreamers. So many of those, the members of that generation were first-generation immigrants, facing a rather reactive set of policies to immigrants following World War I. during World War I and after World War I, everybody was afraid of not what we now call terrorists, but then they were called anarchists. And most of those anarchists were people from Eastern European nations who were associated with Russia and the communist regime that was now growing in Russia and the Russian Revolution. And it was a tremendous amount of fear about that, the first Red Scare. And much of that was against Jews who came, because that was the biggest number of immigrants coming out of Eastern Europe at the time. So in the 1920s, we set two huge immigration laws that make what we're talking about now pale in existence. When we talk about a Muslim ban now, there actually was a virtual ban against people from Eastern European countries because they set up two quota laws that pretty much shut off a great deal of immigration from Eastern Europe that unfortunately led to more people dying during the Holocaust because they could not escape.
Well, they said that there was that boat that came into New York that they sent
The
back.
St. Louis, yeah, that was sent back, and that was as a result of those immigration laws. So right then and there, you see a huge parallel, and because we are still a nation of immigrants, and right now, as we, now about 100 years after those laws were passed, are dealing with that same issue. So that's one. The second one was obviously, what do you do during time of huge economic change? Then we were changing from an agricultural society to an industrial society. So jobs disappeared that were in part of our culture for 150 years. They were now gone, being replaced by new jobs, being replaced by creations of new things. There were migrations, there were emigrations, there were all sorts of things going on. And then obviously the war situation and the fear of war and the fear of battles in the streets. We had battles in the streets. In Washington, D.C., there were battles with the World War I veterans who demanded their bonuses, and the American Army came in and basically cleared them out. We had Hoovervilles during the Depression, homeless people living in tents and wooden structures in Central Park. So all of those issues existed then as they do now, and the question is, how do we learn to face them the same way they did? And obviously, the World War II and racism, and if you want to talk about the Black Lives Matter situation now, well, when there were daily lynchings in the South, Black lives really mattered. When we watched the hoses come out and the German Shepherds come out in Birmingham, Alabama, and then you compare that to Charlottesville. Okay, Charlottesville was a horror story, but nothing compared to what people had to go through back then.
Well, this is one of the things, especially about like my generation. We don't have the same type, like the same extent of issues. People said, your grandfather's generation, they went through these huge wars and stuff. We don't have that type of thing, but we're still facing similar type of issues. They're just more subtle. So when we're trying to change them, they don't seem as big, and there's more pushback because they're subtler. If there's subtler stuff, and it's not as in your face. So it's like, well, that's just how it is now, but it's still not the way it should be.
Exactly. And the case in point that I'm going to raise because of that is what's going on now as a result of the Parkland shooting, where students all across the nation last weekend, all right, and their supporters marched in every major city in the country, and 800,000 people showed up in Washington, D.C. And people talking about, teenagers, how can they do that? Young people, how can they do that? Well, hello, we did that in the 60s, all right? And so it's great to see that, but that's not so subtle because people's lives are in danger. And when people's lives are in danger, that's when I think more and more people will stand up and say something. And so I think there's a lesson because they didn't do it because, oh, my grandfather did it in 1968. Right. They're doing it because it's real to them, and people do things when they're real to them. And so that's a subtle learning experience as well. So, when you look at those marches, you see people in our generation happily joining them because it brings them back to the moments in time where they did it during the 60s and early 70s.
Exactly. We have to take one final break, and I'm Paul Feiner with David Greene and David Bach. We'll be right back.
WVOX, America's great community station.
1460 WVOX.
Now back to the Greenberg Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner, and we're interviewing David Greene. He could make words sing, an ordinary man during extraordinary times. And how do you get the book again?
You get it at Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com, or you can ask at local Barnes and Noble stores who are now beginning to stock it.
I was going to ask about Harry's battle with anti-Semitism, and maybe you could discuss that.
Sure. It was. There are some interesting stories that I learned. He has one one story that's a battle. There's another story that's odd. When he was in the Army and he was stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, he was taken as a right-hand man by a drill sergeant from classic Southern stock. If you had seen the movie Full Metal Jacket and you remember the guy who played the drill sergeant, well, that was him. All right. And for some reason, he and Harry got along real well. So you had this person that we would today stereotypically call a Southern cracker and this New York Brooklyn Jew hanging out together. And Harry somehow broke all the codes because he was able to play tennis at the Fayetteville, North Carolina Tennis Club as a Jew when he couldn't play in New York. He played golf down there when you couldn't play in New York. So somehow, we don't know what happened, but it was almost like a sitcom. When he left the Army and he came back and he started working in the advertising industry, the advertising industry was very anti-Semitic. Basically, they had a code word for Jews, and the code word was creatives, because they hired a lot of Jewish writers, copywriters, artists, illustrators to actually develop the ads. But in many of the non-Jewish owned advertising companies, there was an iron ceiling. You just couldn't rise above it because you were Jewish. So he found that out for a long time. And the only reason that Harry was able to bust through that is because he was multilingual. And because in the 60s, what was now Richardson Vic was expanding its sales of Vicks VapoRub and Lavoris and Clearasil and oil of Olay to Latin America, and he was very fluent in Spanish and nobody else was. They made him the head of international marketing because of that particular skill. But if it wasn't for that, he would not have been able to do anything. Interestingly enough, he became, again, close friends with one of the boss men at the place that he worked. But their friendship outside of work could never be seen at work. That's how closed off that was.
That's really amazing. Now, you also donated Nazi artifacts to the National Holocaust Museum.
Yeah. One of the things that I found in Harry's treasure trove, which I actually found while I was still teaching, at the end of World War II, again, because he was fluent in 7 languages, one of them was German, when the rest of his regiment was being prepared to be shipped out to the Pacific because they weren't sure if the war against Japan was going to continue or not, he was sent to Berlin to translate documents and to help interrogate Nazi prisoners of war and refugees from Germany and Eastern Europe. And so I don't know how he got his hands on these. I doubt very much he was supposed to have taken them back with him, but he had several Nazi pamphlets, speeches, things, for example, that would give mayors instructions about what to do at the end of the war and how to use your Red Cross, and anti-Jewish propaganda and pro-German propaganda even after Stalingrad, after the huge defeat, how to rise up and, we're stronger than everybody else, even though at that point they weren't anymore. So apparently he brought them home, and I used them to teach. I had a student who spoke German. He translated some of them, and I said, oh, my God. So I started using them and used them in the book. And when I was done with them, I said, these are things that needed to be shared. So I donated them, went down to D.C. and donated them to the Holocaust Museum down there. And a few of them, they said, are originals they had not seen before. So that was really something that was terrific, that we could actually pay forward some of the stuff that Harry had done during the war as a result of that.
That's interesting. I'm sort of wondering if you had any thoughts about Harry's experience living in suburbia. And
yeah. Harry came to Ardsley in 1955, when they started building Hundley Estates, which surrounds the high school. And, the only thing up there was Tom Carvel, I think, at the time. And so he moved up there because although the rest of his family, everybody who lived in Brooklyn usually moved out to Long Island, he moved up to Ardsley because his place of work was right across from Grand Central, and he needed to use, that what is now Metro North to get there. So, they were in a brand new development, all those houses that he lived in and I lived in, and that you were referring to before,
Right.
on Joyce Road and Kenneth Road and Edgewood and that whole Poets Corner area. They were all built up at the same time. And, they developed their own sense of community, especially.
And it was also, I know when I started my career, it was a largely Jewish, neighborhood. In fact, right now it's probably one of the last remaining enclaves with a larger Jewish population.
It is, and so they all, because they had that commonality. People, sociologically speaking, people tend to move where people who are like them live.
Right.
And so everybody was moving to this particular neck of the woods. He developed friends for years. My wife, has lifelong friends from when she was 4 years old when they moved in there. But again, it became sort of it was weird because it was a liberal community, but it was also a closed community. You mentioned before when we weren't on the air, a first black,
Right.
thing, and they kind of looked askance at anybody who wasn't one of them, moving into the neighborhood. And it was okay because I think one fellow, I think that one of the first people who moved into the area who was black, he said, I think they worked for the NFL, so that was okay. So, he was professional enough. But again, it's odd because, you're dealing with issues of people who suffered through, discrimination. And,
And-
as you move up that ladder, sometimes you have a problem with people following you up the ladder.
And, I noticed, especially when I was growing up, you have, a number of Jewish people like myself who are more the activists. And then you have a lot of Jewish success stories where people didn't want to rock the boat. Would you consider Harry somebody who was the type that basically wanted to go along, or somebody who would make waves?
I think the difference in what you were saying, Paul, is that you and he are of a different generation. You're a boomer, I'm a boomer. We grew up in the 60s where that was the norm.
Right.
All right, to be, that became the norm for us. Whether it was, a college protest or going down to D.C. to march or whatever it is, civil rights. That's what many members of our generation did. Not everybody, again, which is very similar to today. There are there are 17-year-olds who fight against what the Parkland kids are doing.
Well,
Right.
it's also it's a different ability to mobilize the way that people can mobilize today. They have all this access to social media. They're all over the place on
Huge.
TV.
Huge.
So there's people to help them in the same way, and especially now, within the last 2 years, there's been more of a political awakening where people want to be more involved.
Right.
I know the number of women running for office, because I can never remember the number, is historic. How
Right.
many are people running?
Right. And again, it's a generational thing. When certain crises hit, and whatever the reason is for cultural change that happens, to go back to Harry's generation, they were the Depression generation. The feces hit the fan for them every time they looked around. So they grew up nervous. They grew up anxious. They grew up learning not to rock the boat. So his generation, and so many men like Harry, especially men like Harry, said, you know what, security is more important than anything else. Safety is more important for anything else. I'm not going to take a chance. He stayed at the same firm for 40 years, as many of that generation did, because he was afraid that if he tried to get a promotion or if he tried to move on to another place, he'd lose the safety and the security for his family that he never had as a child. And that's the difference between their generation and ours, who grew up in an era of prosperity and change.
Gosh, I'm so aggravated that the show's over, but it's so interesting, and I recommend your book highly. It's easy reading, and it's really fascinating, and it will bring back memories of the 20th century. So,
And I hope teaches people things too.
right. So the book is He Could Make Words Sing, An Ordinary Man During Extraordinary Times. David Greene, Greene, is the author, and you can get the book on at Barnes & Noble's, Amazon, some local bookstores.
And if you see me walking around with them.
Great. You could stop. So I'm Paul Feiner, Greenberg Town Supervisor, and I'll see everybody soon.
Thanks very much.